Hannah Kim sat in the observation deck of the research vessel, Stellar Pioneer, her fingers moving quickly across her tablet as she worked on her latest engineering project. At 16, she was the youngest person on board, but that didn't stop her from helping the ship's engineers whenever she could. Her dark hair was tied back in a neat ponytail, and her brown eyes reflected the starlight that streamed through the reinforced windows. Warning: solar activity increasing beyond safe levels, the ship's computer announced in its calm voice. Hannah looked up from her work, her heart beating faster. This wasn't part of the normal space weather they'd been tracking. Through the window, she could see one of the nearby stars pulsing with an unusual brightness. Hannah, her father, Dr. Jin Kim, rushed into the observation deck. "We need to get to the emergency pods now." Behind him, her mother, Dr. Myran Park, was already checking her daughter's safety harness. The ship shuddered violently. Hannah grabbed her emergency pack, the one she always kept ready, just like her parents had taught her. They ran through the corridors, joining other crew members who were hurrying toward the escape pod bay. "The solar storm is interfering with our shields," her mother explained as they ran. "The ship's hull won't hold much longer." Another blast rocked the ship, stronger this time. Hannah stumbled but kept her balance. She'd practiced emergency drills dozens of times, but this was different. This was real. They reached the escape pod bay, where crew members were quickly boarding their assigned pods. Hannah's pod was number 17, right next to her parents' pod 18. As she climbed in, she heard the ship's computer again. "Hull breach detected. All personnel must evacuate immediately." "We'll see you on the surface," her father said quickly, helping her strap in. "Remember your training. Stay calm. We love you." "I love you too," Hannah replied, trying to keep her voice steady. Her mother squeezed her hand one last time before they rushed to their own pod. Hannah's pod door sealed with a hiss. Through the small window, she could see other pods launching, one after another. Then her own pod's systems came to life. The display showed their destination, Planet DN-249, the nearest survivable world. But something was wrong. As her pod launched, the controls flickered. The solar storm was affecting more than just the ship's systems. Hannah quickly pressed the backup power switch, another safety drill she practiced. But the pod's trajectory was already off course. She watched in horror as the other pods streaked toward one area of the planet, while her pod veered in a different direction. The planet grew larger in her viewport, a swirling mass of purples and greens under its 3 suns. "Emergency landing sequence initiated," her pod's computer announced. "Warning: optimal landing zone not available. Selecting alternative site." Hannah gripped her harness tightly. The pod's heat shields flared as they entered the atmosphere, and the cabin filled with the roar of re-entry. She closed her eyes and counted her breaths, just like she'd learned in training. The pod broke through the clouded layer, and Hannah caught glimpses of a strange landscape below, crystalline formations and bioluminescent forests. But she had no time to admire the view. The ground was coming up fast. "Brace for impact," the computer warned. The pod's parachutes deployed with a sharp jerk, but they were still moving too quickly. Hannah saw a dense patch of forest rushing up to meet her. Then everything went dark. When she opened her eyes again, the pod was tilted at an angle. Pale purple light filtered through the cracked viewport. The air recyclers hummed weakly. At least they were still working. Hannah ran a quick systems check. Communications were down. Location beacon was damaged, but life support was stable. She activated her suit's oxygen supply and checked the external sensors. The atmosphere outside was toxic. She'd need her suit to survive. The pod's door was jammed, but Hannah knew she couldn't stay here. She had to find a way out and figure out where she was. As she worked to force the door open, Hannah thought about her parents. Were they safe? Had they landed with the others? She pushed her worry aside and focused on the task at hand. First, she needed to survive. Then she could find a way to contact them. With a metallic groan, The pod door finally opened. Hannah took her first look at the alien world that would become her home. Strange, glowing plants surrounded her, and in the distance, crystal spires reached toward the three suns that hung in the purple sky. She checked her suit one last time, grabbed her emergency pack, and took her first step onto planet DN-249. Hannah's boots sank slightly into the soft, purple soil as she took careful steps away from her crashed pod. The forest around her glowed with an eerie light that came from the plants themselves. She had studied bioluminescence in her science classes, but seeing an entire forest lit up like this was different. She checked her suit's oxygen meter. She had about 6 hours of air left. That wasn't much time to figure out her situation. The emergency pack on her back contained basic supplies: water, food bars, a medical kit, and some basic tools. She pulled out her handheld scanner and began taking readings of her surroundings. Temperature, 40 degrees Celsius. Atmosphere, toxic mix of nitrogen and sulfur compounds. Ground radiation levels, higher than Earth normal but within safe limits. She read aloud to herself. Speaking helped her stay calm, even if no one could hear her. A strange sound caught her attention, like wind chimes, but deeper. She turned slowly and saw something amazing. Tall crystal formations rose from the ground about 50 meters away. They seemed to vibrate in the wind, creating musical notes. But when she took a step closer, something even stranger happened. The crystals changed color, shifting from clear to a soft blue. Hannah clapped her hands, and the crystals responded again, this time turning green. They react to sound, she whispered, excitement replacing some of her fear. This could be useful, though she wasn't sure how yet. A warning beep from her suit reminded her that she needed to find shelter. The three suns were moving across the sky, and according to her pod's data, when all three lined up, the surface temperature would become dangerously hot. Hannah returned to her pod and began salvaging what she could. The communication system was broken, but she could use parts from it. She also took the pod's small solar panels and emergency beacon, even though it wasn't working. Her father always said, everything can be fixed or made into something new. As she worked, movement caught her eye. Something was crawling through the underbrush about 20 meters away. Hannah froze. The creature looked like a cross between a centipede and a lizard, with a long, segmented body and multiple legs. Its skin had a metallic sheen, and it moved with surprising speed. Hannah held her breath, hoping it wouldn't notice her. But then she saw something that made her blood run cold. Where the creature touched the plants, they seemed to melt. Drops of liquid sizzled and smoked where they fell on the ground. Acid, she whispered. It secretes acid. She gave the creature a name in her mind. Melter. She needed to remember where she saw it and stay away from others like it. The melter moved away, but Hannah's heart was still racing. She needed safe shelter, and she needed it soon. Her eyes fell on the crystal formations again. They seemed to grow in clusters, creating natural cave-like spaces between them. If she could find a large enough cluster, it might work as a temporary shelter. Hannah gathered her salvaged pod parts and carefully made her way toward the crystal formations. The sound of her footsteps made them change colors, creating a rainbow path behind her. As she got closer, she noticed something else. The air around the crystals felt cooler. She found a spot where several large crystals grew together, forming a small cave. The opening was just big enough for her to climb through. Inside, the temperature was much lower than outside, and the crystals provided natural light as they reflected the bioluminescence from the forest. Using her scanner again, Hannah checked the cave. The radiation levels were lower here. The crystals seemed to block some of it. This could work as a temporary base while she figured out how to contact the rescue teams that would surely be looking for survivors. She set up her equipment carefully. The pod's solar panels could still generate power, and she had enough supplies for a few days. But she would need to find a way to make this shelter safer and more permanent. She also needed to find a source of water and figure out how to replenish her suit's oxygen supply. As the three suns began to align in the sky, Hannah watched the forest outside her crystal cave grow brighter. The temperature rose quickly, but inside her shelter, she remained relatively cool. The crystals hummed softly around her, changing colors with each sound she made. "I can survive this," she said firmly, her voice making the crystals glow a confident blue. "I just need to be smart and careful." She pulled out her tablet and began making plans. She would need tools, better shelter, and a way to defend against creatures like the Melter. But most importantly, she needed to find a way to let her parents know she was alive. After 3 days in her crystal cave, Hannah had learned a lot about planet DN 249's strange daily cycle. The three suns never set all at once. Instead, they took turns crossing the purple sky, creating different colors of light throughout the day. She sat at the entrance of her cave, making notes on her tablet. "Red sun brings the most heat," she wrote. "Blue sun makes the crystals grow faster. White sun seems normal, like Earth's sun." She had named them to keep track: Red Giant, Blue Dwarf, and White Star. When all three suns lined up, something that happened twice each day, the heat became unbearable. But Hannah had discovered something interesting. The crystal cave didn't just protect her from the heat, it seemed to store it somehow. She could feel warmth radiating from the crystal walls hours after the sun alignment had passed. "Maybe I can use this," she said to herself, touching the warm crystal wall. Her voice made the crystals glow green, and she noticed they stayed warm longer when they glowed. This was important information. Hannah had also been watching the local wildlife. Besides the dangerous melters, she had seen other creatures. Some looked like floating jellyfish that changed color to match the crystals. Others reminded her of Earth's deer, but with 6 legs and scales instead of fur. She named these animals floaters and hexapods. The hexapods gave her an important clue about survival. They only drank from certain purple-leafed plants, avoiding all other water sources. When Hannah tested these plants with her scanner, she discovered why. They naturally filtered out the toxic elements in the planet's water. "If hexapods can drink this water, maybe I can filter it the same way," she said, carefully collecting some purple leaves. The crystals hummed in response, turning a curious shade of yellow. But Hannah's most urgent problem was oxygen. Her suit's supply would run out soon. She needed to find a way to make more. That's when she noticed something odd about her crystal cave. The air readings inside were different from outside. There was more oxygen here, but why? She remembered how the crystals reacted to sound. Taking out a small piece of salvaged pod metal, she tapped it against a crystal. The crystal glowed, and her scanner showed a tiny spike in oxygen levels. Hannah's eyes widened. The crystals weren't just storing heat, they were producing oxygen when they vibrated. "This is amazing," she exclaimed, making all the crystals in the cave pulse with bright colors. "But I need to test it properly." Hannah spent the next few hours setting up a careful experiment. She used pieces from her pod's air recycling system and connected them to a small crystal cluster. Then she created different sounds, measuring the oxygen output each time. The results were clear. Certain sound frequencies made the crystals produce more oxygen than others. Low humming sounds worked best. If she could build a device that made the right frequency constantly, she might never run out of oxygen. While working on her oxygen discovery, Hannah also made a map of the safe areas around her cave. She marked where she had seen melters, where the hexapods usually walked, and where the best purple leaf plants grew. The map helped her see patterns in how the animals moved. They all avoid the north side of the crystal fields, she noticed. There must be a reason. She zoomed in on her tablet's map and marked this as an area to investigate later, once she had better protection. As she worked, Hannah kept thinking about her parents. Were they looking for her? Had they survived the crash? She had to believe they were alive and searching. The thought gave her strength to keep working on her survival plans. Suddenly, a loud screech filled the air. Hannah looked up to see a new creature flying overhead. It was huge, with wings that looked like sheets of crystal catching the sunlight. The creature landed on a tall crystal spire and seemed to merge with it, becoming almost invisible. Crystal Glider, Hannah named it, quickly adding it to her wildlife notes. The creature's ability to blend with the crystals was fascinating. Maybe she could learn from it, find ways to use the crystals not just for shelter, but for protection too. As the blue dwarf sun began to set and the red giant rose, Hannah reviewed her day's discoveries. She now understood more about the planet's water, its wildlife, and the amazing properties of the crystals. Each piece of knowledge made her a little safer, a little more likely to survive. She looked at her suit's oxygen meter. 2 days of air left. Tomorrow, she said firmly, I start building my oxygen generator. The crystals around her glowed with a determined blue, as if agreeing with her plan. On this dangerous alien world, every discovery brought her one step closer to survival. Hannah walked carefully through the crystal forest, her boots making soft crunching sounds on the glittering ground. She had been on DN 249 for a week now, and her temporary cave wasn't enough anymore. She needed a real shelter, something that could keep her safe for months if necessary. Her oxygen problem was partly solved. The sound-powered crystal generator she built provided enough air for her suit, but it was noisy and used a lot of power. She needed something better, something bigger. If I'm going to build a proper shelter, she said to herself, drawing on her tablet as she walked, I need better tools first. She looked at the broken pieces of her pod that she'd collected. Metal was useful, but she needed more. A glint caught her eye. Near the base of a large crystal formation, smaller crystals had fallen and broken. Hannah picked up a piece. It was sharp, almost like glass, but stronger. When she tapped it, it made a clear ringing sound, and nearby crystals lit up in response. Perfect, she smiled. She could use these crystal shards as cutting tools, but she needed something to hold them with. Looking around, she spotted what she'd started calling rubber trees. Plants with strong, flexible bark that didn't melt in acid or burn in the triple sun heat. Hannah gathered some fallen bark and crystal shards. Using wire from her pod's control panel, she made her first real tool, a crystal knife with a rubber tree handle. It wasn't pretty, but it worked. With her new tool, Hannah began exploring further from her cave. She needed to find the right place for her permanent shelter. It had to be somewhere safe from melters, protected from the triple sun heat, and close to water and resources. After hours of searching, she found it. A huge cluster of crystals had grown in a circle, creating a natural wall. Inside the circle, the ground sloped down into a small valley. The crystal walls would protect her from the harsh winds that sometimes blew across the planet's surface. Even better, she spotted several purple leaf water plants growing in the valley. Hannah climbed down into the valley and began scanning. The radiation levels were very low here. The thick crystal walls blocked most of it. She also noticed something strange. Some of the crystals had grown in almost perfect straight lines, like they were following a pattern. This can't be natural, she said, touching one of the straight crystal lines. As her fingers brushed it, the crystal glowed, and she felt a slight vibration. She followed the line with her scanner. It led to a small opening in the valley wall that she hadn't noticed before. Inside the opening, Hannah found something amazing. The walls were smooth, too smooth to be natural. And there were markings, not random scratches, but deliberate patterns carved into the crystal walls. Someone was here before, she whispered, her voice making the crystals pulse with light. They built something here. The thought was both exciting and a little scary. Who were they? Why did they leave? But Hannah didn't have time to solve ancient mysteries. She had to focus on survival. This discovery gave her an idea, though. If someone had built here before, this must be a good spot. She could use their work as a starting point for her own shelter. Back in her temporary cave, Hannah began drawing plans on her tablet. The shelter would have 3 parts: a main living space built into the valley, an upper observation post to watch for dangers, and a lower level for her oxygen generator and water filtration system. She could use the crystal's sound-reactive properties to create walls that changed color to warn her of danger. The rubber tree bark could seal gaps and make waterproof containers, and the straight crystal lines she found might help her channel power through the structure. "I'll need at least 3 backup systems for everything," she said, remembering her father's lessons about space station design. Oxygen, water, power, everything needs a backup. As she worked on her plans, Hannah heard a familiar screech. Looking up, she saw a crystal glider landing on the valley walls. Instead of flying away, it seemed to watch her with interest. Maybe these creatures weren't just beautiful. Maybe they could help her spot dangers from far away. Night was coming, and 2 of the suns had already set. In the dim light of the blue dwarf sun, Hannah finished her shelter blueprints. Tomorrow, she would begin building. It would be hard work, but she had no choice. Winter was coming to DN 249, and her scanner showed that temperatures would drop far below freezing. "I can do this," she said firmly, her voice strong despite her tiredness. The crystals around her glowed with a warm, encouraging light. She wasn't just building a shelter anymore. She was building a home on this alien world. The morning light from the white star sun found Hannah already at work in her chosen valley. She had moved all her supplies from the temporary cave to her new building site. Now came the hard part, turning her plans into reality. Her first challenge was the crystal walls. The ancient builders had left straight lines of crystal, but Hannah needed to make new ones grow. She remembered how the crystals responded to sound, growing faster when exposed to certain tones, but making random sounds wasn't enough. She needed something more precise. "If sound makes them grow," she said thoughtfully, "then maybe specific sounds can control how they grow." She took apart her pod's warning siren and mixed it with pieces from the communication system. After several hours of work, she had built something new, a sonic resonator. The device looked strange, made from broken pod parts and crystal shards, but it worked better than she hoped. When she pointed it at a crystal and turned it on, the crystal began to grow in the direction of the sound waves. She could even make the crystals grow into different shapes by changing the tone. "This is amazing," Hannah exclaimed, watching a crystal bend into a perfect arch above her head. But her celebration was cut short by a familiar screeching sound. A crystal glider was circling overhead, and it wasn't alone. 3 more followed it, their crystalline wings flashing in the sunlight. The creatures landed on the valley walls, watching her work. Hannah noticed they seemed interested in her sonic resonator. When she used it, they tilted their heads as if listening to a song they knew. As she worked, Hannah discovered something else. The crystal gliders made different sounds when danger was near. She heard a sharp warning screech and looked up to see 2 melters approaching the valley. Thanks to the warning, she had plenty of time to move to safety. "You're like watchdogs," she said to the crystal gliders. They preened their crystal-like feathers in response, making soft chiming sounds that the nearby crystals echoed. The building work was hard. Hannah had to stop often when the 3 suns aligned, taking shelter in her temporary workspace. But slowly, her shelter began to take shape. The main room grew as she carefully guided the crystal growth. She made the walls thick enough to keep out the cold and heat, with small gaps that she filled with rubber tree bark to make them airtight. Her biggest success came when she figured out how to make crystal windows. By growing crystals very slowly and making them very thin, she created clear panels that let in light but kept out the toxic air. Through these windows, she could watch for danger while staying safe inside. But not everything went smoothly. While working on the lower level, Hannah ran into a serious problem. She had just finished a new section when she heard a cracking sound. The crystal wall was growing too fast, putting pressure on the other walls. If it didn't stop, it could break the entire structure. Hannah's heart raced, but she forced herself to think calmly. Sound makes them grow, she reminded herself, so maybe different sound can make them stop. She quickly adjusted her sonic resonator to a new frequency, one that matched the natural hum of the stable crystals in the valley walls. The cracking stopped. The wild crystal growth slowed and then settled into the same pattern as the ancient crystal lines. Hannah let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. This was an important lesson. She needed to be more careful about how she used the sonic resonator. As the blue dwarf sun set that evening, Hannah looked at her progress. The main room was almost finished, with smooth crystal walls that changed color with sound. The lower level would house her oxygen generator, which now worked much better thanks to the larger crystals she had grown. She had even started work on the upper observation post, where she could watch the whole valley. A crystal glider landed nearby, making a soft trilling sound. The creature had brought something, a small crystal shard that glowed brighter than the others. Hannah carefully picked it up and found it was warm to the touch, even through her suit gloves. "Are you trying to help?" she asked the creature. It made another trilling sound, and the crystal in her hand pulsed with light. Hannah smiled. On this dangerous planet, she had found not just shelter, but maybe even friends. Looking at her half-built home, Hannah felt proud. It wasn't just a shelter anymore. It was becoming something special. A place where human engineering and alien crystal magic worked together in ways nobody had ever tried before. The shelter was taking shape nicely, but Hannah knew she needed more than just walls to survive. Water was her biggest worry now. The purple leaf plants could clean the toxic water, but she needed a way to collect and store more of it. Early one morning, as the red giant sun rose, Hannah noticed something interesting. The morning air was heavy with mist, and water droplets were forming on the crystal walls. The droplets rolled down the smooth crystal surface, making musical sounds as they fell. "That's it," Hannah said excitedly. "The crystals can collect water from the air." She watched as more droplets formed and fell. The colder crystal surfaces collected the most water. Using her sonic resonator, Hannah grew a series of crystal pipes that curved down from the roof of her shelter. She made them in a spiral pattern, remembering how her mother had once explained that cold air falls while hot air rises. The pipes would cool the air and collect water as it moved down. She tested her design during the next misty morning. Water trickled down the crystal pipes and collected in a basin she had made from rubber tree bark. By the time all 3 suns were up, she had collected enough water to fill 3 of her storage containers. But Hannah faced another problem. Her power systems were using too much energy. The oxygen generator, water collection system, and her tools all needed power to work. Her pod's solar panels weren't enough anymore. She sat in her observation post, thinking about the problem. The crystal gliders were perched nearby, their wings catching the sunlight and breaking it into rainbow colors. As Hannah watched them, she noticed how the light seemed to bounce around inside their crystalline wings. "Light energy," she mumbled, reaching for her tablet. "The crystals don't just store heat, they can store light too." This was the answer she needed. She could use crystals to capture and store energy from all 3 suns. Hannah spent the next few days creating what she called power crystals. Using her sonic resonator, she grew special crystals with many internal facets, like natural prisms. These crystals could catch light from any angle and store its energy. She placed these power crystals around her shelter, connecting them to her systems with thin crystal threads that carried the energy where it was needed. Soon she had more power than her pod's solar panels had ever provided. While working on the power system, Hannah made another discovery. Some of the ancient crystal lines she had found could carry energy too. She followed these lines and found they led to a hidden chamber deep under her shelter. The chamber was small but amazing. The walls were covered in carved symbols that glowed faintly when she touched them. In the center stood a crystal column that hummed with energy. Hannah's scanner showed it was still working after who knew how many years. She was carefully studying the symbols when her tablet made a sound she hadn't heard in weeks. The emergency beacon signal. Someone had received her distress call. The message was broken and full of static, but she could make out a few words. Korean Space Agency. Rescue mission. Coordinates received. Hannah's hands shook as she tried to reply, but the signal was already gone. Still, this was wonderful news. People knew she was alive. They were coming to find her, but she didn't know how long it would take them to reach her. That evening, as the white star sun set, Hannah checked her shelter systems. The water collectors had filled another storage tank. The power crystals glowed with stored energy. The oxygen generator hummed quietly, making the air clean and breathable. She had built all of this herself, using only what she could find on this dangerous planet. A crystal glider landed on her observation post, making a happy trilling sound. More of them had started staying near her shelter, as if they had adopted her into their flock. They helped watch for dangers and sometimes brought her useful things they found. Interesting crystals, pieces of her crashed pod, even some purple leaf plants that she could grow near her shelter. "Thank you," she said to the creature. It chirped back, making the crystal walls glow softly. Hannah smiled inside her suit helmet. She had done more than just survive on DN-249. She had learned its secrets and made it her temporary home. Now she just had to wait for rescue. But she wasn't worried anymore. Her shelter was strong, her systems were working well, and she had everything she needed to survive. She looked at the glowing symbols on her tablet screen. The Korean Space Agency's message. Help was coming, and thanks to her hard work and clever thinking, she would be alive and well when it arrived. Hannah was expanding the lower level of her shelter when she made the biggest discovery yet. While growing a new crystal wall, her sonic resonator hit something different, something that made a metallic sound. She carefully cleared away the surrounding crystals and found a door. The door was made of a dark metal she had never seen before. Strange symbols covered its surface, similar to the ones she had found in the underground chamber. When she shone her light on them, they seemed to absorb it rather than reflect it. "This has to be from the same people who built the crystal lines," she said to herself. Her voice made the nearby crystals pulse with curious colors. Even they seemed excited by the discovery. Hannah studied the door carefully. There was no handle or keypad, but she noticed something interesting, a circular pattern of crystals around the door's edge. When she touched one, it hummed the same note as her sonic resonator. Sound controlled, just like everything else here, she realized. Hannah adjusted her resonator to match the crystal's tone. When she played it, the crystals around the door lit up one by one, like a combination lock opening. With a soft hiss, the ancient door slid open. Cool air rushed out of the opening. Hannah checked her scanner. The air was still toxic, but the radiation levels were very low. She turned on her suit lights and stepped through the doorway. She found herself in a long hallway. The walls were made of the same dark metal as the door, but they were covered in crystal lines that gave off a soft light. Her footsteps echoed as she walked, making the crystals pulse in response. The hallway led to a large room that took Hannah's breath away. It was filled with machines, strange devices that combined crystal technology with metal parts. Most were dark and silent, but a few still had glowing crystals in them. "This is amazing," Hannah whispered, her engineering mind trying to understand what she was seeing. One machine looked like it might be a more advanced version of her sonic resonator. Another had crystal growths that reminded her of her power storage system. In the center of the room stood what looked like a control panel. When Hannah approached it, crystals embedded in its surface began to glow. A hologram appeared above the panel, showing a map of the entire valley. She could see crystal lines running everywhere, connecting different rooms and chambers he hadn't known existed. But what really caught her attention was a large crystal sphere floating above a pedestal near the control panel. Unlike the other crystals, this one was perfectly smooth and clear. When Hannah looked closely, she could see tiny points of light moving inside it, like stars in a miniature galaxy. She reached out and touched the sphere. Immediately, the room filled with light as more holograms appeared. They showed images of the beings who had built this place. Tall, elegant creatures that seemed to be made partly of crystal themselves. The images showed them building the crystal structures, growing them just as Hannah had learned to do. They were teaching themselves to work with the planet. Hannah realized as she watched, just like I did. The images showed how they had learned to use the crystal's properties, developing technology that worked in harmony with the natural world. But then the images change, showing three suns moving into a new alignment, different from the daily triple sun event. The crystal beings looked worried. They began building something huge, something that used crystal technology in ways Hannah had never imagined. The last images showed the crystal beings entering large chambers deep underground. They sealed themselves inside, and the crystals grew over the entrances, hiding them completely. "They're still here," Hannah said in amazement. "They didn't leave. They're hibernating." She checked the time markers in the hologram. According to the data, the crystal beings had gone into hibernation thousands of years ago, just before a massive solar event that would have made the planet's surface uninhabitable for centuries. Hannah's mind raced with questions. Were they still alive in their crystal chambers? Would they wake up someday? Had they known humans would find their planet? Her thoughts were interrupted by a beeping from her tablet. Another message was coming through, stronger this time. "Rescue ship approaching DN 249. Estimated arrival 48 hours. Hannah looked around the ancient control room. She had found something incredible. Proof that humans weren't the first intelligent beings to live on this dangerous world. The crystal beings had learned to survive here, just as she had. And now she had found their greatest secrets. Captain Du Yun Lee stood on the bridge of the rescue ship, Star Seeker, looking at the purple planet below. His team had been searching for survivors of the Stellar Pioneer crash for weeks. Now they had finally found a signal from the last person they expected. "Are you sure it's coming from Hannah Kim's pod?" he asked the communications officer. "Yes, Captain. But it's not just a distress signal anymore. She's built something down there. Our scans show crystal structures that aren't natural." Meanwhile, on the planet's surface, Hannah was preparing for the rescue. She had moved her most important discoveries from the ancient control room to her shelter. The crystal sphere now sat in a special holder she had grown for it, still showing its mysterious lights. Her crystal glider friends were acting strangely. More of them had gathered than ever before, perching on the valley walls and making worried sounds. Hannah checked her scanner and understood why. A massive solar storm was approaching the planet. That's why they're coming now, she realized. The rescue ship must have seen the storm coming. She knew from her crash that solar storms could destroy spacecraft. They had to get her off the planet before the storm hit. Hannah worked quickly to save all her research data. She documented everything. The ancient technology, the crystal being's history, her own innovations. She couldn't take much with her, but she could take this knowledge. Suddenly, her scanner started beeping wildly. The storm was arriving faster than expected. The crystal gliders screeched in alarm as the sky turned a dangerous red color. All three suns seemed to pulse with angry light. Hannah's shelter systems began reporting problems. The power crystals were overloading from the solar radiation. The crystal walls hummed with strange frequencies she had never heard before. Her communication system crackled to life. "Hannah Kim, this is Captain Lee of the Star Seeker. We're entering the atmosphere now. Do you copy?" "I copy," Hannah replied quickly. "But there's a solar storm coming. It's too dangerous to land." "We've detected the storm," Captain Lee's voice came back. "We have 15 minutes before it hits. We're sending down a shuttle. Can you get to these coordinates?" Hannah looked at the map on her tablet. The landing site was at the edge of her valley. She could make it, but she had to decide quickly what to take with her. She grabbed her tablet, the small crystal sphere, and her sonic resonator. Then she remembered something important. The ancient crystal beings had survived a massive solar storm in their underground chambers. Maybe her shelter could survive too. Working as fast as she could, Hannah used her sonic resonator to activate the crystal defense systems she had discovered in the ancient control room. The crystal walls of her shelter began to change, growing thicker and stronger. "Please let this work," she whispered, making the crystals glow with determination. She had built this place using both human engineering and alien crystal technology. Now it would face its biggest test. Hannah sealed her suit and stepped outside. The sky had turned a deep crimson, and she could see waves of energy rippling through the air. The crystal gliders flew in circles above her, screeching warnings about the approaching storm. She began running toward the landing coordinates. Behind her, her shelter's crystal walls were changing color, preparing for the storm. The ground shook with thunder that wasn't from clouds, but from the angry suns themselves. Through the red haze, Hannah saw the rescue shuttle landing. Its silver hull reflected the strange light, making it look like it was on fire. The landing ramp opened, and two people in spacesuits ran out to meet her. "Hannah, are you okay?" one of them called. She recognized the voice. It was Captain Lee himself. "I'm fine," she shouted back. "But we have to hurry." They helped her into the shuttle just as the storm's first powerful waves hit. The crystal gliders scattered, diving into protected caves in the valley walls. Hannah watched through the shuttle window as her shelter disappeared into the red haze. The shuttle lifted off, fighting against the storm's powerful winds. Hannah held tightly to her precious cargo, the crystal sphere and all her research data. As they rose through the atmosphere, she saw something amazing. Her shelter was glowing brightly through the storm, its crystal walls deflecting the deadly solar radiation, just as they had been designed to do thousands of years ago. "Incredible," Captain Lee said, looking at the glowing structure below. "You built all that yourself?" "Not exactly," Hannah replied, holding the crystal sphere carefully. "I had some help from the planet's first inhabitants." The sphere pulsed softly in her hands, its tiny lights dancing like stars. 1 month after her rescue, Hannah stood at the observation window of the Korean space station, looking down at the blue curve of Earth. She was finally home, but her mind often wandered back to the purple world she had left behind. "Hannah," a familiar voice called. She turned to see her parents rushing toward her. Dr. Jin Kim and Dr. Myran Park had been rescued by a different ship and had only just arrived at the station. Hannah ran to meet them, and they held each other tightly. "We were so worried," her mother said, wiping tears from her eyes, "when your pod went off course. But look what you did," her father added proudly, holding up a tablet showing images of her crystal shelter. "You didn't just survive. You made discoveries that will change everything we know about space exploration." Hannah smiled and pulled out the crystal sphere she had brought from the ancient control room. In the space station's artificial light, it glowed even brighter than before. The tiny lights inside it moved in new patterns now, as if responding to Earth's presence. "The science team can hardly believe their readings," a new voice said. Dr. Sun Mi-kang, the Korean Space Agency director, walked up to join them. "The technology you found is centuries ahead of ours, maybe even thousands of years ahead. And you learned to use it in just a few weeks." Hannah had spent days explaining everything to the scientists: how the crystals responded to sound, how they could store energy and produce oxygen, and most importantly, about the crystal beings who had built the original structures. "The best part is that your shelter survived the solar storm," Dr. Kang continued. "Our satellites show it's still standing. The crystal defense systems you activated are still working. We want to use your designs to build the first permanent research base on DN 249. "Really?" Hannah asked excitedly. "When?" "As soon as possible. But this time, we'll build it properly with a full team. And we want you to help lead the project." Hannah looked at her parents, who nodded encouragingly. At 17, she would be the youngest person ever to help design a space base. But then, she was also the youngest person to survive alone on an alien planet. Later that day, Hannah gave a presentation to the space agency's top scientists. She showed them her detailed notes, drawings, and the data she had collected. When she demonstrated how the crystal sphere worked, the whole room fell silent in amazement. "The crystal beings who built the original structures were smart," she explained. They didn't try to fight against the planet's dangerous environment. Instead, they learned to work with it. That's how I survived, too. After the presentation, Hannah received the Korean Space Pioneer Medal, the youngest person ever to earn this honor. But she was more excited about the plans for the new research base. They would build it near her original shelter, using the same crystal technology she had discovered. "We're calling it Project Hannah," Dr. Kang announced. "It will be the first of many bases built using crystal technology. And maybe someday we'll meet the crystal beings themselves when they wake up." That evening, Hannah sat with her parents in the station's garden room, looking at plants from Earth. The crystal sphere sat in her lap, its lights moving in peaceful patterns. "I was scared at first," she admitted to her parents. "But then I remembered everything you taught me. Dad's lessons about engineering, Mom's advice about studying the environment before making decisions. It all helped me survive." "You did more than survive," her mother said proudly. "You showed everyone that humans can adapt to any challenge if we're smart and careful. And you proved that sometimes the best solutions come from working with nature, not against it," her father added. Hannah held up the crystal sphere, watching its lights dance. One of the scientists had said it might be some kind of communication device. Maybe someday it would learn how to use it to talk to the crystal beings. As she looked out at the stars, Hannah thought about her shelter on DN 249, still standing strong against the planet's harsh environment. She had left more than just a building there. She had left a bridge between two civilizations, human and crystal being. "When can we start building the new base?" she asked Dr. Kang, who had joined them in the garden room. "The first construction team leaves in 3 months," Dr. Kang replied. "Are you ready to go back?" Hannah smiled, feeling the comfortable weight of the crystal sphere in her hands. "Yes," she said confidently. "DN 249 was my home for a while. Now it's time to help make it a home for others too." The crystal sphere pulsed with a warm light, as if agreeing with her words. Somewhere on that purple planet, under the light of 3 suns, Hannah's legacy was just beginning.